Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Berishaj, founder of C Admissions, and I want to start with a question that might feel a little bit uncomfortable. What if you're doing everything right, and that is exactly what's holding you back in your MBA applications? Most of you joining today represent the upper echelon of MBA applicants. You're the people who've optimized every visible metric. Your GMAT score is in the top 695 in the Focus Edition. Your GPA signals discipline. Your work experience has been at brand name firms that definitely open doors. Your recommenders are senior leaders who genuinely respect your work. On paper, you are exceptional, and yet the reality that keeps high performers up at night is when your application lands on an admission officer's desk at Wharton, Booth, Kellogg, MIT, you look identical to the other 400 applicants who you are competing with. This is what I call the 90% trap. It's the invisible ceiling that separates the high performers from the ones who are admitted and the ones who are not. It's definitely not a failure of credentials. It's a failure of differentiation. And it's the signal most applicants who are applying to M7s and top 15 are experienced. So here's what we know from working with applicants who have navigated this successfully. The moment you realize the competence is the floor, meaning it's the baseline, not the ceiling, everything changes. The schools you're targeting aren't asking, are you qualified? They're asking, do we feel certainty when we read your story? Can we see you leading? Can we trust your judgment under pressure? Those questions aren't answered by your GMAT score. They're answered by narratives, the strategic clarity with which you translate your experiences into meaning, your ambition into conviction, and your presence on paper into the kind of leadership profile that moves decision makers to believe in you and to offer you a seat at the table. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to deconstruct exactly how the top 10% of applicants who are admitted architect that transformation in their stories, not through gimmicks, not through oversharing or manufacturing vulnerabilities, but through disciplined strategy. So this session is designed for people who refuse to be average and among the exceptional. And if that's you, this is exactly where you need to be, and take notes as we go through this process. I want you also to ask your questions in the comments, as we're going to take some time at the end to direct your questions or directly answer your questions. So let's talk about what actually happens on the other side of the application portal. At M7 programs, admission committees are processing between 5,000 to 7,000 applications per cycle. That is a lot for perspective. For schools like MIT, Sloan, or Wharton, acceptance rates hover between 14 and 19%. But here's what those numbers don't capture. Within the qualified pool, candidates who meet academic and professional threshold of those high caliber candidates are close to 40 or sometimes even 50%. That means that real competition isn't about getting into the qualified pool. It's about being chosen from within it. And that decision is made on entirely different criteria than the ones that got you through the first filter, which is your test scores, academic performance, brand name, companies, etc. Admission officers at this level are trained in the psychological pattern recognition. They're not reading essays to verify facts. They're reading to assess judgment, to assess your maturity, self-awareness, and leadership presence. They're asking questions like, does this person know why they want an MBA? Or are they just checking boxes? Can they articulate goals that feel both ambitious and grounded? Do they demonstrate intellectual humility alongside confidence? Will they contribute to classroom dialogue in ways that elevate other individuals? These aren't quantifiable metrics. They're narrative markers, and they are where the 90% of strong applicants fail, not because they lack the qualifications, but because they don't know how to surface them strategically. And an example would be, I worked with a consultant at a top-tier firm. He had a 750 GMAT Classic score, Penn undergraduate, MBB experience. On paper, excellent. His first draft of essays read like a LinkedIn profile. I led a team of 6, delivered 2 million in value, promoted twice. Technically, fine. Psychologically inert. When we rebuilt his narrative, we shifted the frame from what he did to what he learned about himself through the high-stakes decision-making that he was involved in. Same career, different interpretation. And the result is that he was admitted to both Wharton and MIT with scholarship offers. That's what we're here to close. That's the gap that we're here to close today. The admission landscape has fundamentally always been challenging, but even more so now with the use of AI. Over-optimization without strategy creates sameness. Everyone sounds the same. And sameness, no matter how polished you are and what GMAT score you have, doesn't win at the level of M7 and T10 or T15 that you are applying to. So let me show what differentiation actually looks like in practice through pattern recognition. When admission officers read applications, they're not scoring you on a rubric. They're assessing certainty, the feeling that you belong, that your trajectory makes sense, and that your goals are grounded and ambitious. And what that looks like from a undifferentiated applicant would mean that the stats check out, experience is solid, essays are well written, but the adcom finished reading your materials and think, this person is qualified, but so are 300 others in the same fashion. The differentiated applicant, same stats, same experiences, but the adcom finishes reading and thinks, I can see exactly where this person is going. I believe they'll get there, and I want them in our program because I see them as a match for our culture. The difference isn't what you've done, it's how clearly you've interpreted what you've done. I see this pattern constantly. 2 applicants from the same consulting firm, similar project experience, similar test scores. One written essay that catalogs achievement, and the other writes the essays that reveal judgment and growth. The first applicant sounds competent, but the second one sounds like someone the admission team wants to bet on. And the wanting to bet on, that sense that you're already belonging or becoming the leader that you are describing through your past experiences, is really what triggers the admission. And the tactical insight is that the adcom can tell within the first few paragraphs whether you've done the strategic work, not because of what you say, but because of how you structure your thinking. Applicants who haven't done the work start with chronology. After graduation, I joined X firm, I did these things. They list their accomplishments sequentially, state generic goals, sound like they're answering an essay prompt. Applicants who have done the work start with insight. Something like, what I've learned about leadership is, what I've learned about this sector is. And they connect experiences thematically. State goals with earned specificity, meaning they anchor them on their own experiences. They sound like they are making an argument. That difference is in structure signals cognitive sophistication in the thinking. It tells the adcoms that you're not just smart, because all of you are smart, but you are reflective. And reflection is what separates managers from leaders. Bottom line, you don't need perfect stats to be differentiated. You need clarity about who you are, what you've learned, and where you're going. When that clarity is present, your applications are going to create certainty, and certainty is what moves decision makers. And that's what we'll be going into more details. So now let's talk about what the top 10% are actually doing that creates that separation. First, they build a thesis of self. Most applicants treat their applications like a highlight reel. Here's what I did at company X, McKinsey, Amazon, insert any company that we see so often. They've gotten promotion, so here's my promotion, here's my community involvement. Of course, it's additive, and of course, it showcases, comprehensive accomplishment, but it also, again, sounds like all the other McKinsey, Accenture, Amazon, Meta applicants who are applying to these top-ranked schools. The top 10% do something fundamentally different. They articulate a thesis, a central argument about who they are, what they've learned, and why they're positioned to lead at the next level, which is what is going to support their MBA application. So for example, one can have an application thesis that reads something like, I'm someone who translates technical complexity into executive level strategy. I lead by building systems that outlast my tenure. I've learned that transformation requires both analytical rigor and cultural fluency. These are organizing principles. Every story, every example, every goal in the application reinforces this thesis. The application becomes an argument, not a catalog. Second, the top 10% create a cohesion across all components of the application, not just the essays, not just the resume, not just the letters of recommendation. The top 10% recognize that your resume, your essays, and recommendations are not independent documents. They are chapters in the same story of the individual who is applying. So if your resume emphasizes quantitative impact, but your essays focus on interpersonal growth, there's a cognitive dissonance. Adcoms are going to notice this nuance. Strategic applicants are going to be orchestrators. So if your essay discusses leading through ambiguity, your recommenders should reference a specific instance when they observe that. If your goals emphasize building inclusive teams, your resume should show progressive people leadership, not just technical output. If your personal statement reveals intellectual curiosity, your optional essay or additional information in the application portal should show how you pursue learning outside of the formal structures of your organization or in college. Every piece of the application should feel like it was written by the same person with the same worldview, obviously aside from your letters of recommendation. And a third, they use essays that reveal judgment, not chronology. Chronology is boring in your application. So the tactics of the top 10%, excuse me, that distinguishes them in the context of like a strong essay versus a weak one. So a weaker one is going to say, I did X, then Y, then Z. I learned A, B, and C. Whereas a strong essay is going to say, I was faced with a decision where both options held merit. Here's how I thought about the trade-offs. Here's what I chose and why. Here's what that reveals about how I lead. The difference is interpretation. Adcoms don't need to know every single nuance of what you've done. They need to understand how you think under pressure, right? And that top percent use examples not as proof of competence, but evidence of their maturity and their readiness for the next level. They show self-awareness, they acknowledge complexity, they demonstrate that they have evolved because of their experiences, not just through their experiences. So let me give you a concrete example. A standard applicant would say, I lead a cross-functional team to launch a new product. We have exceeded revenue targets by 20%. Great, that's sound, right? But the top 10% is going to, and by top 10%, what I mean is these are the individuals that are getting interviews across schools that they're applying to, right? This top 10% are going to say, when my team hit a design impasse, I realized the conflict wasn't technical, it was cultural. Engineering valued being precise, marketing valued speed. I created a decision framework that honored both perspectives and turned the tension into a competitive advantage. The product launched successfully, but what I learned was more valuable. That leadership isn't about resolving conflict, it's about channeling it. Same situation, same project, completely different narrative impact on the reader, who is the adcom evaluating your candidacy. The first version says, I'm capable, but the second version says, I'm a leader who thinks like an executive, even though I have only 5 years of work experience. And that's really the gap. And it's entirely within your control to close the gap at this point, especially if you're applying to round 2, but also when you're applying in the future, whenever that is. So let's get a little bit tactical. There are 3 strategic shifts that, when you execute them properly, move you from that 90% to the top 10%. And I'm going to walk through each one with specific before and after examples. So shift 1 is from being safe to being specific. Generic goals are the silent killers of strong applicants, and they're everywhere. I cannot tell you how many times I have to have these conversations around being specific in your goals. So an example would be, I want to transition into consulting to solve complex business problems. I aim to work in sustainable energy to make a positive impact. My goal is to lead fintech companies that demonstrate access to financial services. These goals aren't wrong. They're just non-differentiated, and quite frankly, I see them so often, and I'm small potatoes in the context of how many applicants the admission team reads. They could apply to 500 other applicants who are going to do the same thing as you. But the shift is where the top 10% replace generality with granular conviction. They don't say what they want to do. They explain why this specific path is important, is inevitable given their specific experiences. So the standard is, I want to move into healthcare strategy consulting, but the specific top 10% version would read something like, I spent 3 years in hospital operations and realized that the biggest barrier to patient outcomes isn't clinical, it's operational design. Specifically, I see how misaligned incentive structures between payers and providers create waste that directly harms patients. I'm building towards a partner-level role at a healthcare-focused consultancy where I can redesign these systems at scale, starting with the value-based core models in oncology, a space where I've built both clinical credibility and strategic fluency. That's not just more specific, it's psychologically complete. You as a listener here and the admission team as a reader feels certainty because they're matching this with their resume, with their experiences, and the goal doesn't become this aspirational, jargon that we read so often. It reads like it was built based on experiences specifically, and this is the reason why you are required to have 5 years of work experience before, or the expectation is 5 years of work experience before you actually start an MBA. Shift number 2, moving into the emotional. Now, before anyone panics, I'm not asking you to write a therapy essay. I'm talking about something much more sophisticated. Most strong applicants write essays that are logically sound. I did A, it taught me B, therefore I want to do C. The structure is clear. The reasoning is valid, and the essay also is plain, unmemorable. Admission teams see this so often. Why? Because logic builds respect, but emotions are going to build trust. Adcoms need to feel something when they read your application. Not pity, but feeling connected to your values, what you care about. They need to believe that you are someone they'd want in their classroom, on their campus, representing the school for the rest of your life. And here's how top 10% do this. They use precise human language. Instead of "this experience taught me resilience," they say, "I learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying present when everyone is feeling panicked." They acknowledge vulnerability strategically, not oversharing, but showing moments where they didn't have it all figured out. Like, I misread the situation. I over-indexed on speed when the team needed clarity. That failure recalibrated how I lead, which of course showcases growth from the eyes of the admission team. They also write in a voice that sounds like how they'd speak to a respected mentor, not on a resume or on a TED Talk, but genuine reflection of what they've learned. I cannot tell you how many times I read essays that are very, very clearly written by AI. Even if you are using your own examples, the AI is going to calibrate for clarity and lose the essence, the emotions that are needed in your essay. So let's look at some examples. So the logical version would sound like, "Leading this project taught me the importance of stakeholder management and clear communication." The emotional version would say, "Halfway through this project, I realized I'd be so focused on execution that I'd forgot to bring people along. The work was technically sound, but the team felt disconnected. I learned that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making everyone else feel like their judgment matters." The second version doesn't just inform the reader, it lets them see the person during their leadership moments, the reflective components of that leadership moment. And that is where we are connecting with the reader from an emotional perspective. The third shift top 10% make is interpretation. This is the shift that separates senior professionals from executive candidates who you all are wanting to be. Most applicants focus on what they produced: revenue generated, projects delivered, team managed. Again, table stakes when you're competing at the M7 and top 10. The top 10% of these applicants focus on what they learn about themselves through producing these outcomes. So output-focused example would read something like, "I led a team of 10 to deliver 5 million project ahead of schedule." Great accomplishment, right? But an interpretation-focused writing would read something like, "Leading a high-pressure project taught me that my instinct under stress is to over-control. I had to learn that delegation isn't about losing oversight. It's about building trust in others' judgment. The project succeeded, but the more valuable outcome was realizing that leadership requires letting go of being the hero." And I cannot tell you how many times I read a hero essay also that it's not what the business schools are expecting. And I know you all want to be the hero because the top 10% of the highest caliber applicants are there. There's a hero element in there that we, all want to solve the world's problems, but not in your applications. So AdCom wants to see that you are reflective, that you are coachable and mature enough to admit where you've had to grow and that you've taken that into consideration even elsewhere. So the pattern of the top 10% is, don't try to be impressive. You already are. What you're going to do is try to be interesting. Don't prove that you're qualified. Show that you are the right fit. And the shift from proving to revealing is what moves decision makers, aka the admission team. So let's pull back the curtain on what actually happens when an admission officer reads your application. First, obviously, you have to understand that a typical adcom at an M7 is going to read 500 to 800 applications per cycle. They spend an average around 20 minutes on your full application, right? I know you spent months on it, but they will spend about 20 minutes on it. That includes your essay, your resume, your recommendation letters, and looking through your transcripts. They're not reading for comprehension, they're reading for pattern recognition. And they're specifically trained to assess 3 things, and we're going to go through each one. First is your intellectual maturity. They're asking, does this person think like a graduate level professional, or are they still operating with an undergraduate mindset? And this is also very often visible, especially if you are a younger applicant than the class average. So undergraduate thinking looks like, I work hard and succeeded. I worked 12 hours a day, right? Graduate thinking is, I encountered a problem that required me to synthesize multiple disciplines, challenge my assumption, and make a decision with incomplete information. The marker of intellectual maturity is complexity. Can you hold 2 competing ideas in tension? Can you acknowledge trade-offs? Do you see nuance? If your essays read like a case study with a clean resolution, you're likely underselling your intellectual range. And that is a disservice to you as an applicant, and to the school, of course, because they don't get to see your intellectual range if you don't actually put it on paper, given that they only have 20 minutes to spend on your story. Second is emotional calibration. So adcoms are assessing, will this person thrive in a high pressure, highly collaborative environment, or will they be the person who is trying to dominate a classroom, trying to show how smart they are, or a discussion, or is going to dismiss their peers' perspectives and can't handle critique. Your tone is your tell. If your essays are overly confident, I knew exactly what to do, my approach was clearly the right one, that signals low coachability. And again, I can't tell you how many times I have to mention this in private sessions, because these are nuances where you as an applicant may not necessarily notice that you're making. But the admission team is trained to look for this. So if your essays are overly apologetic, which is another element of, missing that, emotional calibration, that is still problematic. So example would be, I struggled with this. I wasn't sure if I made the right call. What does that sound like? You are not someone who's confident, low conviction, right? The top 10% are going hit a very specific tonal balance, whereas confident in their judgment, but humble about their learnings and open about being wrong. That is the balance a top 10% is going to have in their application. And the third lens is cultural fit and contribution. This is the least understood part of the evaluation, and it's where most applicants are definitely going to lose ground. Adcoms aren't just saying or asking, will this person succeed? They're asking, will this person make others better? Schools like Kellogg and Fuqua, for example, are explicitly prioritizing collaboration. But even schools known for being a little bit more competitive, like Wharton and Booth, they are also looking for people who can elevate the room, because collectively you are better than individually. So how are they going to assess this? Through your language. Do you use I or we when describing team accomplishments? Both are fine, but the ratio between how are you using that is really important. You can't write an entire essay about your contributions where everything is we, because how do I know what is you and what is the collective group, the team that you are working with, right? Do you acknowledge others' contributions, or is everyone's story, or is every story that you share only about you being the hero in the room? Do your goals suggest you're building towards something, or just building your resume? By that, what I mean is, are you just racking up brand names without having cohesive narrative or structure in terms of where you're going? The top 10% demonstrate that intellectual generosity, the willingness to credit others, learn from peers, and see their MBA not as a credential, although we all do a little bit, but more as a community and as a tool to help them go to the next level of their impact and their contribution in the business world. So one final insight on authenticity here. Every admission guide that you have read, that you have watched, that you have attended any information session, they all talk about be authentic. But authenticity without strategy is just oversharing. And again, I say this quite often. Disciplined vulnerability is key. And what does that mean? Sharing moments of doubt or failure, but only when you can articulate what you learn. Revealing your thought process, but not every insecurity. Definitely admission teams don't want someone who's extremely insecure about every decision that they're making. Being human, but not at the expense of appearing ready for graduate level rigor, right? Be human, but you have to show that you are ready for this next step. The top 10% understand that authenticity isn't about full transparency. It's about strategic transparency, revealing enough to build connection, but maintaining the professionalism that signals that you are a future executive. That's what adcoms are looking for. And once you understand this lens through which the admission team is reading your material, you can then architect your application according to that particular school. Now let's look at 3 real transformation. These are clients we worked with here at C Admissions who started in the top 90%, like strong candidates, but had that, fell into that 90% trap. Strong profile, but conventional narratives, and ended with admission to programs they initially thought were out of their reach. So I'm sharing these not as success stories for their own sake, but to show you these specific strategic pivots that unlock the differentiation, that not only were they interviewed to multiple schools, but they also had multiple offers. So the first case is a private equity associate. They had a 740 GMAT Classic score, top undergraduate institution, 3 years in the middle market PE fund, strong deal experience, solid leadership in portfolio company operations. But the problem was that his first draft essay read like an investment memo. Every paragraph was very structured. Analyzed X, identified Y, I executed Z. Technically, fine, but emotionally, flat. Adcoms reading his application could see he was smart, but they couldn't see how he led. There was no interpretation, no self-awareness, no indication that he'd evolved beyond being an executor, like someone who was just doing tasks. What we did was we helped him reframe the from logic to leadership. So instead of describing deals, we focused on a single moment, a portfolio company CEO who resisted his operational recommendations. And in his original draft, this was a one-line mention. In the revised version, it became the centerpiece of an essay about influence without authority. We asked essentially, what did you learn about yourself in that moment? How did you recalibrate? What does that reveal about how you'll show up as a leader post-MBA? All of that reflection, all of that probing led to the essay becoming focused on learning to lead through trust and not just data. And the result is that he got into MIT Sloan and Booth with scholarship for both. The difference wasn't a profile change because we didn't have time to do that. It was the interpretation of his profile that made a huge difference in the outcome. Second case, we were working with a consultant with an average GPA. Profile was 3.3 GPA from a state school, 720 GMAT Classic, 4 years at Big Four, specialized in healthcare operations. So the problem was that she was worried her GPA would disqualify her from the top programs. She spent months polishing her resume and GMAT score to compensate, but her essays were defensive, focused on proving she was smart enough rather than showing why she belonged at these schools. So we stopped her, or we guided her to stop trying to overcome the GPA and start building a thesis of someone who brought a lot of experience and differentiated experience. Her real differentiator wasn't her GPA, because again, that's table stakes or even below the class average, but it was her mission clarity. She spent 4 years working with hospital systems and had developed a specific, credible vision, building a strategy function within a health tech company focused on clinical workflow optimization. We rebuilt her essays around that thesis. Every story, her consulting work, her volunteer experiences as patient advocate, her side projects advising a digital healthcare startup reinforced the same narrative. I'm not just interested in healthcare, I'm building towards leading it now before an MBA. And she got into Wharton with scholarship. What we've learned from this is that when your narrative is strong enough, weaknesses become contextual footnotes, not disqualifiers. So your GPA or your GMAT, or you have a fail grade in your undergraduate, that is just a footnote in the context of your entire application. You really need to focus on what strengths you bring to the table. And the third case is the startup operator. This was someone who had a 665 GMAT focus score, 3.7 GPA, 5 years at a high growth tech startup that went from Series A to acquisition. This person led product operations, managed cross-functional team, deep exposure to scaling challenges, obviously in that space. So he assumed his low GMAT would eliminate him from M7s, and his essay focused on metrics and not really the narratives on what he did. So it sounded more like a pitch deck than really a leadership narrative. So we shifted his work from performance to purpose. In our conversation, we uncovered that something his essays really never mentioned, before we had these multiple discussions. And that is that he joined the startup world because he believed that operational excellence was really the most important thing to creating access to technology. His parents were immigrants who struggled to navigate digital systems, and he saw his work as democratizing usability. That became the thesis. That is the conviction. That is the reason why, right? We helped him build his application around leadership as service, showing how every operational decisions he made was rooted in a belief that technology should work for everyone and not just for those early adopters who understand the system. He got into Ross and Fuqua, and the lesson here is that when your story has emotional connections to something that is deeply personal to you, stats really are going to become secondary. Not irrelevant, of course, because they do matter, but not disqualifying either, right? So your job is to really capture that intrinsic drive that moves you from where you are to where you want to go. So the pattern across all these three cases is we didn't change their profiles. They were who they were. They came at the tail end of the application journey. But what we did do is we changed their interpretation of their profile, of their experiences. We didn't add accomplishment, we added meaning to their stories. And that's the shift that moved them from that competent applicant to that multiple admit applicant, that is like the top 10%. So it's not really about doing more things. It's about revealing more of what's already there that the admission team would never get to see if all they did was look at your resume. Before we move into the next steps, I want to give you a framework you can start applying today. This is the architecture we use with every client to build narrative cohesion. And it's 4 components. First is a thesis. In one sentence, what is your leadership identity? Not your resume, not your goals, your identity. So this could be, I lead by building systems that scale beyond my presence. I translate complexity into clarity of non-technical stakeholders. This thesis should be specific enough that it couldn't apply to anyone else, but broad enough that multiple stories can apply to it. Second, evidence. What are 3 to 4 stories from your career that prove this thesis to be true? These should span different contexts: a professional challenge, a team dynamic, a moment of failure, a value-driven decision. Each story should reveal how you think, not just what you did. That's the differentiator. Third, evaluation. How have you changed over time? Adcom wants to see growth. It's not just promotions, although promotions are specific markers. If your stories show the same version of you when you were 22 as you are now, maybe 28, that's a red flag. The top 10% show intellectual and emotional progress, and that is what you need to communicate in your application. And fourth, trajectory. Where is the growth taking you? Your goals should feel like the natural extension of your evolution, not necessarily a pivot, although pivots are normal, but a deepening of your experiences in terms of where you're going to go and the kind of impact you want to make. If your thesis is about building inclusive teams, your post-MBA goals should reflect that. If your story emphasizes systems thinking, your career trajectory should be towards roles that require architectural leadership. The power of this framework is about being really coherent in your story. When all 4 components align, your applications are going to stop feeling like a collection of documents that you are asked to do that you didn't really want to do. And we're going to start feeling like a case for admission, a material, an application of someone that the admission team is really excited to have in their classroom. That's what the top 10% do differently. And that's exactly what we teach and what we coach at C Admissions. So one thing that I want you to take away from here is you got a lot of information. What do you do with this? I want you to start evaluating your profile. So start with the coherence test. Read your resume, read your essays, then ask, do these documents feel like they were written by the same person with the same worldview? Your resume emphasizes quantitative impact, but your essay focuses on people leadership. Absolutely disconnect. The top 10% create psychological coherence. Every component reinforces the same thesis in different words, right? And that's what you need to be looking at. Second, the specificity test. Look at your goals essay. Remove any school name or company-specific reference. Now ask, could this essay apply to 50 other applicants with similar backgrounds? If the answer is yes, your goals are too generic. This is hugely important in the application. Your goals should feel like they're already in motion and not something that you're starting in business school, right? The MBA is the accelerator, not a pivot. 3, look at the emotional resonance test. This one, it's really hard to self-assess. So what you're going to do is you're going to actually solicit support. So give your essays to someone who knows you well, a mentor, a colleague, a friend, and ask them, does this sound like me? Can you hear my voice? If they say something like, this is really well written, but it feels a bit too formal, that's definitely a red flag. Top 10% write in a voice that recognizably theirs, not casual, not overly polished, but authentically reflect how they think and how they communicate all the time. And that is something that you are wanting to do before you move forward, right? Now, if you're running these diagnostics and realize there are gaps, and to be frank, most people I speak to, there are definite gaps. It's no reason to panic, but it is a moment for you to act. You still have time to act. The difference between 90% and the top 10% isn't that the top 10% get it right on the first try. Absolutely not. No one gets it right the first try. It's that the top 10%, they recognize where the gaps are and did the work to close those gaps strategically. That work takes time, and you have to recognize that it does take time. To bring meaning to a story, it's not about writing an essay really quickly, right? It takes intellectual honesty, and often it takes an outsider's perspective, someone who has seen the pattern you're too close to see. You know your story in and out, and you're going to fill the gaps naturally that someone who doesn't know you, which is going to be the admission team, will not. And you need to see those before you submit your application. And that's where coaching becomes invaluable. Not to write your essays for you, of course not, but to help you see your story with clarity that moves the decision makers, given that they have a lot of backstory, to fill in. Some red flags, and I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I realize I'm running out of time. Red flags to be mindful of, being generic. So if your essays include phrases like, I'm passionate about, I want to make an impact in, I've always been interested in, through my MBA, I hope to do XYZ. You're using placeholders and you're wasting invaluable space. The top 10% are going to replace those phrases with something. I realized that. What I've learned is the patterns I've observed are. Those are phrasing that are helping build the narrative forward and get that emotional connection. Red flag number 2, resume regurgitation. If someone could reconstruct your resume by reading your essays, you are not using your essays strategically. Essays should interpret your resume, not repeat it. They should answer the so what, the X factor, the question that your resume cannot answer. And red flag number 3 is safety storytelling. If your story in your application ends with success, you're not showing growth. Top 10% includes moment of failure, misjudgment, uncertainty, but also learning as a result of that. And red flag number 4, misaligned recommendations. So if you're not having strategic conversations with your recommenders about what themes to emphasize, you're leaving one of the most powerful assets to chance, because your recommenders want to help you, but if you're not guiding them, they don't know in which direction you want them to go. So if you're seeing these red flags in your own materials, here's what I want you to understand. You are at a stage where most strong applicants get stuck. The question is, are you going to recognize it and course correct, or are you going to submit materials hoping for the best? Top 10% choose the former. And that's a choice that is obviously going to make a huge difference in the outcomes of their applications. So we're definitely over the 40 minutes. So I want to just invite you to connect with us. You can join our YouTube channel, where we host a lot of content like this, discussing school-specific details, application material details, and that can be really helpful in your development of your story. The other component that we do is we host bi-weekly Q&A calls. The next call is going to be tomorrow at 8:30. You can join, that's called the MBA Strategy Circle, and that's hosted every other week, Tuesdays, either 8:30 or 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 a.m. or 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are moments where you can bring in questions. We talk about this thing with specificity to the individual applicants. And then if you're looking for full comprehensive coaching to guide you through all the steps in your own story to put together a compelling narrative, that is through our comprehensive coaching. And you can reach out through our website, cadmissions.com, to discuss your narrative, your experiences. We definitely do not work with everyone, not because we're trying to be elitist or anything like that, but because this kind of work, the kind of building this kind of strategy requires a lot of time, and anyone that we choose to say yes to is going to get our full coaching experience. And because this is not a transaction, this is transformation that goes beyond just admission. It's a transformation of how you see your own story as well. So let's move to questions in the comments, and then we'll see how much time we have left. I'm going to just quickly glance through them to see what questions we have. Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading through commentary. So the question here is, I have several aspects that I would like to incorporate, given that there are social, cultural, and professional endeavors that I'm looking to start, develop, and achieve on campus. Should these objectives be highlighted individually, or should they move into one another as a cohesive narrative? For example, building on institution or startup that preserves a dying language in my culture, even though my focus is on business and engineering. Your focus should be on business, unless you're building some kind of technology that is focused on supporting greater population than just this one element of the culture. And I don't know how much, like how wide this is. I don't know anything about this language that you're trying to preserve, but it has to have a bigger business impact than only on the dying language. So that's something that you may have to reflect on. I would not try. So the person continues to say, what is the best way to shine a light on multifaceted application without being shallow with my entrance and without losing core focus on the purpose of an MBA? Just remember, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the business school, while you want to be authentic, you don't have to share every single thing about all your thoughts about everything that you may want to do in the future. You have to really build a theme and anchor it on that. It has to be a theme that is focused on what's feasible, attainable. How is a business school going to help you? What are you going to do post-business school? And obviously, people have multiple interests. They are dynamic individuals, and that's okay. But this language element may not necessarily be the thing that is going to move the needle in your application. So anchor it on. That could be sort of a part of it, but it does require something that's more attainable in the business world setting. Okay, another question. In engineering, if the promotions are not explicit, from an engineer 1 to an engineer 2, can they be demonstrated in an increase in responsibilities Yes, absolutely. You would be able to showcase that in your application, even in your resume. You're going to be able to do that. That's obviously going to be reflected in the kind of way that you showcase the projects that you're dealing with, the kind of scope that you were given. Because from my understanding of the engineering lingo, that's really what the difference between an engineer 1 and an engineer 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that, right? It's just the scope. It's not necessarily visible that much between bands. So you are able to communicate this in your application. You are also able, meaning in your resume, but you're also able to communicate this in other parts of the application. But you don't just over-repeat yourself. Say it once, expect that they will hear you the first time you say it. Excellent. All right, I think we made it on time. Again, if you guys are interested in looking at how we can support with your applications, I encourage you to reach out at cadmissions.com. Whether you're going through interview preparation, which, you know, MIT just released today interview invites. So we do support applicants who are going through interview prep, or if you want comprehensive coaching for, you know, round 2 applications or future applications, I highly encourage you to reach out. Last questions. How to highlight growth in the finance industry when there are just transactions to transactions? Promotion seems like repetitive way of showing growth. When we work with applicants from the finance sector, that is something that we actually spend quite a lot of time, because in finance, I know your success is dependent on how many transactions did you go through, right? However, your contributions to each transaction can be different from one another. How you think about those experiences, what did you bring to the table? Those are pieces that you need to do sort of soul searching, memory recollection of those experiences to really be able to capture the difference between transaction A and transaction B, especially if they sound very similar to one another. So it's not going to be easy. And also, you know, in the financial services space, you are an overrepresented candidate. So the next person, maybe you're an analyst, the next analyst like you, it's going to have a similar story to you. So your job is to make sure that you give enough detail that it's going to differentiate you and your contributions to the classroom from the next person who has similar experiences to you, right? And that comes down to how much are you introspecting on your experiences, and how are you giving meaning to your experiences in a way that is going to add value to the conversation. Because at the end of the day, the value that you bring to the classroom is the way you think. And the way you think is influenced by your experiences, but there's an element of your personality that comes through in the way you think that is unique to you. So even if you have a colleague where both of your jobs are identical, the way you see the world and the way that colleague sees the world is going to be different. And your job in the application is to showcase that difference, because that's what's going to differentiate you from them, especially if you're both applying to the same schools. All right, I think that's the last question for today. Thank you again so much for being here with me today. At Admissions YouTube channel, we host every single week a different topic. So you can definitely join our channel to be notified about our future content. And we're always here on GMAT Club's platforms as well to address any questions you may have. Thank you very much for being here and for the thoughtful questions that you asked in the comments. See you next time.